you have a solemn duty, and Joe had a solemn duty to take seriously what he had created. He had created what could very easily tilt from the perfect plan to the perfect storm. And that's what it did. It went from this wonderful plan that would have ultimately made them all fabulously wealthy. They'd lived past 2000 and had this plan. Instead, it becomes the perfect storm.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell features guests each week to discuss prominent topics for those over 55. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. Continuing what really has been a series, and we found really the things that we do on this show that are the most popular to you, it turns out, not surprisingly, that they often involve the lives and the misadventures, the mistakes and whatnot of famous people, successful people. So I think that is a marvelous learning device. So we stick with it, and there is a lot of opportunity for us to not only find this interesting, even entertaining, but also to make mental notes of the things that you could do differently, even though these mistakes often are made by people who are often very wealthy, but still the principles that underlie these mistakes are applicable to all of us. It's just that it may in fact be more catastrophic in financial terms. But the human cost, when you look at the impacts on families and whatnot of failing to plan, it's the same at all levels. So with that perspective, this week we're going to talk about somebody by the name of Joe Robbie. Now, some of you are thinking, who's Joe Robbie? And others are thinking, what, he has to tell us who Joe Robbie is? So we're going to assume that some of you don't know who he is. Huge figure in sports, but I'm going to hand it to Marlea to sort of give us an overhead. We'll talk through a little bit of an introduction of him.
Yeah, so Joseph Robbie was an American attorney, politician, and he was actually the principal founder of the Miami Dolphins. He founded them in 1966 as part of the American Football League expansion, which the American Football League went on to become the National Football League that we know today.
Yeah, they merged in 1970.
That's correct. And he partnered with head coach Don Shula, and the Dolphins secured 2 consecutive Super Bowl titles and the only all-famous perfect season of 1972.
This is a perfect season in football. I had to be sure that meant what I thought it meant. I confess I'm not a football pundit, but apparently it means you don't lose not only any games in the regular season, you don't lose any games in the playoff season. So that is impressive. As a matter of fact, it's never been done before.
Yeah,
no,
not since. There's been some teams that have had perfect seasons, but not in the playoffs or anything like that. But this was, every single game. They didn't lose at all.
It's never been done before. So this guy, with the Miami Dolphins, those of us who are old enough may remember how big the Miami Dolphins were. They were just this juggernaut in pro football and consistently were they went to Super Bowl twice, but they were in the Orange Bowl for like 10, 11, 12 seasons.
Yeah.
And they were just a hugely popular team and a hugely successful team. Ditka, he was the coach?
Shula.
Yeah, Shula. So those of you who know the name Don Shula, he was
so big, yeah.
And he was a minor owner, I think, just a very
He had
small.
A part in it. I think that Joe Robbie, he founded it and he funded some of it, but Don Shula came in and funded the rest and was head coach.
Yeah. So in the city of Miami, and even in Florida, I would say, he's a legend. And even though that the stadium was later, and we'll talk about this, but the stadium was later sold, and it became the Hard Rock Stadium.
Hard Rock Stadium, yep.
Hard Rock Stadium. And now many people in Florida have continued and refuse to call it anything else but the Joe Robbie Stadium, which is what it was originally.
Strong roots are essential for a healthy tree, especially your family tree. That's why you work hard to take care of your family every day. At Tucker Allen, we know that taking care of your family means planning for the future. Our team provides personalized estate planning, to help you protect your family, your legacy, and your future. From wills and trusts to long-term care and estate planning, count on Tucker Allen, personalized estate planning made simple.
So, let's talk a little bit about some of the things he did. So he acquired this football team.
Yeah.
And then he chooses to build a stadium.
Yeah, so the first 21 seasons that the Dolphins had, they played at the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida, which is actually where the Joe Robbie Stadium is also. And then in 1976, the city of Miami, who owned that stadium, approached Joe and they were like, hey, we're quadrupling your rent because you're so popular, you're making so much money, we can do that to you. And so Joe was like, I don't really want to do that. And he had been playing around with the idea of building a stadium to begin with. And so now he was all set to do that and wanted to go forward with that plan. So he found some land and he found a place to do it. And he was actually the first privately owned multi-purpose stadium in the United States.
So he funded it himself.
Yes.
And this is a massive, beautiful stadium in use today, the same stadium.
It's massive. It was a multi-million-dollar complex. He put up everything he owned, his Dolphins, and he borrowed against future ticket sales, which is kind of, iffy because you're borrowing against, if this is going to work or not. But yeah, a lot has been played at that stadium. Really, they went from the Orange Bowl and moved everything over there, and it was a huge success.
So he was a risk taker, but he was an innovator. And now we think of large stadiums as being this partnership between a city or some governmental entity where they put up some of the money, and then you have the private sector put up some of the money. You'll sell PSLs, which is what we did at the Rams. I mean, there are gimmicks today or techniques by which somebody can avoid paying out of pocket the cost of a stadium of this magnitude. I'm sure in today's dollars it would have been like $1 billion.
So much.
So he really did. He innovated and he showed the way for other professional teams in many ways. He helped coordinate this merger between the AFL and the NFL that we now take for granted, but that didn't occur till 1970. So, and a couple things too about his background. He was from South Dakota, and I think, as you mentioned, he became a lawyer. He went to the University of South Dakota. So you wonder, how does he get from being this lawyer in South Dakota to owning this magnificent team in Miami? And he gets there by way of, he apparently had some clients who were South Dakota clients, but they also had Washington offices, so he's working in Washington. And he ends up being the general counsel for the AFL. So this would have been pre-1966 because he buys the team in 66, and the team is in the AFL at the time. So he develops these contacts and these understandings of how pro football works, and he has the vision to see that this will someday be, what it has become. And so he managed to acquire this team through his contacts and financing and whatnot. So he's just an all-around impressive guy, and people in Florida have nothing but respect for him. I would say people throughout sports in professional football. So now let's talk about his estate planning. So he did estate planning. So this is not a case where, a guy is rich and doesn't do anything, assume he'll live forever, whatever they're thinking. This is a case where he did estate planning, but it was very humdrum, meaning that it was entirely unimaginative. It was something that would have been okay if he were just a typical person. But I think that he simply had a trust and a will.
Yes, that's correct. He didn't really have anything beyond that, nothing that detailed. I mean, it detailed where his share of the Dolphins went and so on and so forth, but not really anything to do, to get out of way of estate planning taxes or anything like that. And I just don't think that he ever realized how big any of the stadium or the Miami Dolphins would become. Like you were talking about his history, he grew up really poor. His dad was an immigrant and his mom was the daughter of immigrants, so they never really had much money. And then going into, law school, everything, and even then, he didn't have much money until he came into the stadium and the Miami Dolphins.
Yeah, so it does seem a little surprising that a lawyer would not think through this, but I think you're right. I think his background even though he'd gone to law school. I think he was kind of, wowed to some extent by things. He was very pleased with these transactions, I'm sure. And he just didn't give the time and attention to estate planning that he should have. I think he was very consumed in the moment. And he probably didn't think that he would die as soon as he did, because he was only in his...
He was only 73.
73. So I started to say late 60s. But 73 is still young, even in the 90s. And so I think that he didn't see himself dying at that age. I'd like to think that if he had lived longer, he'd have thought, look, I need a much more sophisticated plan. So really, the estate plan he had is something that you could have as estate plan, which for many of you, I'll assume you're not in his position, is a magnificent plan, meaning he had a revocable trust, which can do a lot of stuff, not some of the stuff he needed, but it can do a lot of stuff. It can certainly head off family issues. It can control money. It can provide for the needs of family, multi-generational, still give you all the control you want during your lifetime. Then he had it backed up with a pour-over will, which, again, good device for 98% of us if you have it in conjunction with the revocable trust. But that was what he did. And so he could have gotten this estate planning done for, say, $2,500 to $3,000 in today's dollars. So it's the sort of thing that you would expect anybody who was concerned about their estate and had accumulated a reasonable amount of assets, you'd expect them to pay that. But for the sort of planning that he did, and I'll use today's dollars to make the point, you would happily, and I use the word happily because it accomplishes so much, he should have spent around, by contrast to the $2,500 I'm talking about now, he should have spent around $30,000, 25 to 30. And those of you who are thinking, whoa, that's a lot of money. Not if you sit down and look for a few minutes at the amount of money that he could have saved here. So this will make more sense to you as we walk this through. So he goes ahead and does this planning. He goes about his life. I don't know how many years this was done before he died.
I couldn't find that either. I think, obviously, it was before he opened the stadium. Because, he only died 60, because it was opened in 87, and he died, about not long afterwards. 6 or so years, of the stadium being open. So what complicated this scenario is that, there was a lot of debt and there was overhead associated with this, with this vision that he had of building the stadium himself. He had arranged for some co-ownership, but the point is it was all private money. And even though he didn't own 100% of the stadium, still it was a joint venture in which there was going to be some negative cash flow for a while. In other words, it wasn't going to make money for a while. It was a great plan long term, but in the short term, it wasn't going to generate the sort of profits that he hoped for. The problem with this plan, though, was that he died, meaning that if he had lived, he would have made the necessary cutbacks. The family would not have been in a position to say, we want more money, we want more cash flow. Things would have been tight, but he would have been able to make the moves to get him through the period, because we all know what lay ahead, and it was this golden era of ownership of an NFL team. We know the value of those teams and how quickly the values went up. So he just needed to hang on a little longer. He needed to live longer, and he didn't. So suddenly you have a series of events that are not uncommon when somebody dies. So let's kind of set the stage up for at the time of his death, he had a number of children, and these children were kind of participating in various ways with the stadium as well, right? Yeah. So he had 9. From what I know, Mike Robbie was the general manager, and eventually we'll get into this, but he went on, and some of the siblings actually fired him from that position. But they all had kind of an interest in the stadium, especially after he died, because he owned that 50% of it, and that was passed down.
So, but prior to his death, several family members were involved, including his wife, Elizabeth.
Yes, that's correct.
And she was a first wife, I think?
She was the second. I believe he was married only once, or excuse me, of course he was married only once before, but I believe he was only married for a couple of years. He had, I believe, 2 children out of that, 2 of whom died, and then they went on to have all of their other children.
So there were 9 children, I think, alive when he died.
That's correct.
So maybe 1 or even 2 of those could have been from the first marriage. We don't know which 2 died.
I believe the 2 from the first marriage died.
Both of them had died.
Yes. So he had 11 kids altogether. I believe it was stated that 1 from his and Elizabeth's marriage died, and then the 2 from his previous marriage died. So.
Okay. Wow. All right. So big family. I'm sure things were not perfect, but the point is he had things under control. Mm-hmm. So he dies. He has a trust. He names 3 of the children, 3 boys.
2 boys and 1 girl, Tim, Janet, and Dan.
Okay, they're the trustees of this, what was a revocable trust. So when he dies, of course, the trust becomes irrevocable. The problem is that the assets are in the estate. So the assets, were to be put into the trust through what's called the pour-over will. Those of you who watch this show at all or have had some estate planning done, you know what that is. A pour-over will is a very simple will. It says, I want any stuff that wasn't in my trust when I died, I want you to put it in my trust now. So that's all a pour-over will is. Ideally, nothing would go through probate because everything would be already in the trust. Remember, if it's already in the trust, it doesn't go to probate. Well, in this case, it did go to probate. It wasn't in the trust. And this produced a problem that is very common for people. I won't say rich and poor, I'll say rich and middle class, meaning anybody who can own a business, even a small business. And that's that sometimes assets, such as a business, and sometimes a piece of real estate, will be 80 to 90% of the value of the entire estate. Mm-hmm. And that was what happened here, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So talk about these 2 assets that represented 90+% of the estate.
Yeah, so it was obviously the Dolphins football team and the stadium. They were illiquid assets, so not, tons of cash flow. But the way that his estate plan was set up was that it was going to take care of his wife Elizabeth and the beneficiaries. And from what I read, Elizabeth was still getting around $300,000 a year from all of that, even without tons of cash flow, but she still wanted her 30%. And I'll let you speak more on that.
Yeah, that is the problem. Is this is a very common plan that someone will have a provision that, look, I want my assets to be held and the income paid out until the death of my spouse, my surviving spouse. So my surviving spouse needs income, so I want him or her to have all the income from these assets, these 1 or 2 big assets. And then after my spouse dies, then I want the asset. It can be sold if it needs to be, but in any case, it's divided among all the children, whether it's the income or it's the asset sold and the proceeds divided. People do it different ways. And then you establish trustees, of course, who are really making the final decisions. For example, whether an asset is sold or not after the death of the surviving spouse. But the idea is that the asset is held. This important asset, often a business is regarded that way, is to be held, and then all the profits paid out to the spouse, not the children, the spouse, and then when he or she dies, then to the kids. So that's a good plan, except in this case, because of these recent moves that had been made to fund the building of this stadium, this huge undertaking that had great promise, remember, down the road, but no one to shepherd it through this period. So Elizabeth was not going to get any money. I mean, I'm sure she got some, but apparently by the formula that was in the trust, it was not going to produce much money for her. Mm-hmm. So we have a problem. The surviving spouse would have to lower his or her lifestyle. Or in some cases, the surviving spouse wants to raise their lifestyle, that's understandable. I'm not critical of that at all. But in this case, though, clearly these investments, huge promise, but it would take a few years. And she wanted money now because she was getting old. So she decides to do something that Florida law permits, and at the time law around the country would permit. and that's called taking an elective share. So taking an elective share is the right of any spouse to do. Today, it's the right of any spouse to do. So it means that if you decide that you're going to disinherit your spouse, well, there are limits to how well you can do that. And this is a very popular law. It's been around a long time. Some cases, you can take 50%. But the idea is that you cannot choose to disinherit entirely your spouse. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't have to give your spouse everything, but you can't, give her nothing. So in this case, everything was going into the trust. So even though there's a provision that she was to get income from these assets of the trust, well, it doesn't change the law. The law says that she has a right to claim 30% of the assets. She'd be getting none of the assets. Put aside the income. She'd be getting none of the assets going into the trust. So even though she was provided for by Joe in a way that is normally a very common technique, according to the law, it technically meant that she had the right to assert her elective share, which she did. And she said, I want income, so I'm going to take 30%. And that meant 30% of the asset. And that meant probably that in order to accomplish this, there would have to be a sale of assets. Not to mention, it triggered taxes being due much sooner than they would otherwise have been due. So ballpark on the value of this estate, I think after debts, they originally thought it was like $80 million.
That's correct. I believe it was around 78 to 80 million. Yes.
Yeah. So $80 million. Well, it turns out that the taxes came to $47 million all in. So $47 million. And that means that there was no way to hang on to those assets. Even if the kids could have worked out something to give Elizabeth enough income, it just wasn't going to prevent this huge debacle with the taxes. So the taxes are due in 9 months, not 9 years, 9 months. So 9 months from the date of death. So this produced a crisis, and this is very common. Again, you don't have to be rich to be in this position. If you own a business, if you own a nice piece of real estate, an expensive piece of real estate, a home, a family farm, very common family farms, because people, it's been in the family for generations. So in this case, sadly, they had to rush to sell the assets. The family did. The guy who came in and bought both of them was the guy from Blockbuster, Huizenga.
Yes, that's correct.
Huizenga,
and he was also bringing the Major League Baseball to Florida as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So we know Huizenga, the story of Blockbuster. So his future wasn't too good. But one thing though that we can be sure is he got an incredible bargain. Mm-hmm. So let you step behind the curtain as to other bad aspects once you start going off this cliff I'm describing. Is when Elizabeth decided that she wants to force this sale, she announced that she's going to do an elective share. So that means those assets that she takes are no longer subject to the will, to the revocable trust, as well as the pour-over will that was in place before. Normally, that pour-over will and the revocable trust are put in place by husband and wife. And I'm sure, I don't know this is a fact, I'm willing to bet that they were both involved in this estate planning. So it means that whenever he passed away, he thought that he had provided a plan that was going to be good for the children and Elizabeth, and they were all going to live by that plan. But because it was done as poorly as it was done, when Elizabeth decided that she was going to take her elective share, then that 30% was taken out of the original estate plan. So whatever, I'm sure they talked about before which kids were to get it, presumably all the kids equally. Well, suddenly the kids were put in a position of those who agreed with this tactic of Elizabeth taking out of their plan that the family had in place. Probably Elizabeth too had the original plan in place. So she's decided to take this 30%. So you had kids who aligned on either side of that dispute. So it breaks this family apart where there's lengthy litigation. Kids, as you might imagine, are not talking to each other, probably are not to this day.
Yeah.
So it was this very ugly, expensive litigation, and it all was just consuming money that they didn't have enough anyway, not to mention it triggered taxes sooner than they should have been triggered. So it's like they're fighting over a corpse, so to speak. By the corpse, I'm not talking about Joe. I'm talking about what was this valuable, wonderful estate with this huge future. And now because of the taxes, because of the expenses and other things that had gone on in terms of the family relationships, I'm sure there's a backstory.
Yeah, there was some stuff that I read that didn't say, they were the happy football family that everybody thought they were. There was a lot of drama that happened. There was just some things that everybody didn't agree with. And so I think when all of this started happening, it finally, like you said, broke everything down, split everyone down the middle, and they took their sides.
Well, so the team ended up selling for, what was it? Was it about $70 million?
Yes, that's correct. So they didn't.
So somewhere, and that was a huge discount of the real value. But one reason that it ends up selling for that number is that you end up with the family had each hired experts because they wanted to argue one side, who the side arguing for the 30%, they're going to do the 30%, and they had to figure out what is that number that the Elizabeth was seeking. Well, the people who are going to get more money, the children, by sticking with her, even though it's 30%, she would reward the kids who are going to be close to her. So their team, so to speak, to use a metaphor, their interest was in arguing that this asset was worth a whole lot of money so that the 30% would be a bigger number. But the tragedy of that is they're creating a record for the IRS. So the other team, because they're wanting to minimize the value of the property, thinking primarily about tax issues, they would otherwise, and they did argue for it to have as little value as possible. But they also argued that because 30% was going to be pulled away, so they wanted to argue that that 30% was worth as little as possible. So you end up with them, because of their fight over this 30% division, they end up arguing values and creating a record that the IRS subsequently uses testimony of experts about the value to conclude what the tax bill is going to be. And they conclude the tax bill is going to be $47 million. So, now $47 million is a lot today, but you can imagine at the time in the early 90s, that's 3 times at least as much, so maybe 4 or 5. There's a lot of inflation in some areas versus others. So, to give you a sense of the sort of bargain when this went on the auction block, meaning that these assets, there aren't many people, it's not a big market of people that can afford to buy this football team along with this complicated situation with the stadium, even though clearly it had a lot of value and it needed some more time to prove it, but there was debt, associated with some negative cash flow. So it just was prey. It became prey for somebody to come along and pick who could come up with money instantly, and this guy did with Blockbuster, and they swoop in and buy this for this ridiculous amount. To give you a sense of the bargain, it was sold like in 2010, which is not that many years later, for $1 billion.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's kind of crazy too, because what I was reading is to sell a team, you have to have 21 people of the NFL board sign off on it as well. And so they had to get all of that done first. And I mean, it wasn't a quick and easy process. So I'm sure just whoever, like you said, whoever can come up with the money first, we're going to try to get this done and try to get it approved and then move on from it.
Yeah, and that raises another point. I'm glad you brought that up, is it really wasn't an open market. An open market is when you can say to the world of people who have that much money, this is what you can buy. And that's not a big market, but the point that you made really drives it home, is really the person had to have the sort of relationships to get approval from this group of millionaires. So suddenly you're down to, the person they select, and it just no way that's what you call, a sell on the free market. So, anyway, it was urgent. They needed the money. Remember, 9 months. 9 months is no time. And meanwhile, they're in the middle of this ugly litigation. So it was just a disaster. And it's sad. Families, during part of this, Elizabeth replaced some of the trustees, or some trustees got fired, and there was more lawyers involved in that. I don't know what portion of the estate was consumed in litigation, but ultimately they ended up firing. Was it Mark that you said was general manager?
Yes, Mike Robbie was the general manager, and they the trustees from Joe's estate, because Elizabeth passed shortly after shortly after she filed for that 30% and got it. So then she had the trustees, the 3 children trustees over her estate. He had 3 of the children as trustees over his. And it kind of just all went back and forth. It was a huge mess.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that fact up too. Is saddest of all, maybe, is the fact that Elizabeth dies like 3-4 years later. So all of this mess, and for what? Elizabeth dies in 3. I think it's 3 years.
It was about 3 years later. It wasn't very long at all.
It's just so tragic and pointless. Here's the thing. You have to hold Joe accountable. I mean, when you assemble whatever assets you have, I mean, if you were somebody who only owns a family farm, but it's a family farm that's important to you, maybe in part because it's been the family for years, the bottom line is it has great importance to you and your vision for your family. Or a business. Businesses, of course, are commonly regarded that way. Well, you have a solemn duty, and Joe had a solemn duty to take seriously what he had created. He had created what could very easily tilt from the perfect plan to the perfect storm, and that's what it did. It went from this wonderful plan that would have ultimately made them all fabulously wealthy. They'd lived past 2000 and had this plan. Instead, it becomes the perfect storm. So here's what, for example, what could have been done. There are various remedies for this, but one way, if you anticipate that someone is going to die with significant amounts of taxes, and there's not liquidity, like you have that business or you have farmland, whatever it is, then you can provide for that. You can go ahead and create what's called an ILIT. It's this irrevocable life insurance trust. The whole idea is that even though you're old, yes, you can buy life insurance. Often you buy it before you don't wait until you're in your 80s to buy it, but often, like Joe easily could have foreseen that from the time that he was buying that interest, say in the mid to later 60s. So he could have been young enough to have made some decisions that would have allowed him to be able to have life insurance in place. And yes, the premiums are significant, but the point is you create a pot of money so that when you pass away, the money was used by the ILIT. It's not taxed. It's not taxable money. So it rushes in to pay off creditors. It rushes in to pay off the IRS. And I mention creditors because you can have co-owners and others, people who have liens against an asset. So there's lots of reasons you want a pot of liquidity. If you're one of those people that have 1 or 2 big assets that if they are sold, you want them to be sold at a very leisurely pace to know that over a 4 or 5 year period so that you're getting the best buyer. Even if the team had been sold at that time and the stadium, and they'd been in a position to do the proper marketing, to go through a substantial amount of time for people to be able to look at it. I mean, there's lots of millionaires who, if they'd have been happy to have bought the team, if they had the sort of time to do due diligence that they want to do. And for an investment like that, due diligence means a year,
yes,
or 2 years, or due diligence means you take a lot of time to look at it, and the seller knows this, and that's the way often big transactions are done. A fire sale will scare off a lot of people. You may think, well, it's a fire sale, why wouldn't anybody buy it? It was still complicated. So it was somebody who was willing to swoop in, willing to get the approval of this board, and could make the buy. So had there been an ILIT created, that's just one point that would have headed this off. What about the fact that the entire team could have been transferred and ownership interest into an irrevocable trust. That could have been done when the team was worth maybe $5 million. In other words, whenever you do a transfer like that during your lifetime, it's like estate taxes. It's gift taxes. Gift and estate are really, today, it's unified taxes. So you can give something away. If you give away $100 million while you're alive, you pay gift taxes, and it's the same price as if you transfer $100 million when you die. The gift and estate taxes are interchangeable. And while it wasn't a unified system back then, still the same idea is that you paid something. But the whole idea is that you make the transfer of assets like that you see a big future with, and he saw a big future. I mean, he was a visionary.
Yeah, I mean, and they were winning left and right, so I don't know why he didn't see a big future, and he put everything he owned up for that stadium. So
a legendary. You just raised a point. Another point is, in this case, it wasn't just a football team; it's a legendary football team. So incidentally, maybe this is part of the reason I'm not I apologize to those of you who are football authorities, but I imagine that none of this helped the team, so that may be the reason that Miami kind of ceased to be this powerhouse team.
Yeah, and they took all the family out of the team too, and that's who the team knew. And so they just kind of left him hanging with a new owner and everything new, which is just crazy for a team like that.
Yeah, and I don't want to pick on the guy from Blockbuster because, he may be a nice guy, but I'm willing to bet that he did not understand football the way Robbie did.
No, I mean, he was bringing Major League Baseball into Florida, not football. That's a completely different sport. So I don't think he did at all. And I mean, even if he had the coaches to back him up, that still doesn't 100% guarantee you're going to keep leading that legendary team.
Yeah, so it is. And so had he, for example, transferred the asset into a trust at that time, he would have paid very little gift taxes because the value would have been so low. Then that means this, at the time of his death, whenever it occurred, there would be zero taxes owed. Zero, because he didn't own it. So when you die, you're only taxing what you own. If you had transferred it into this trust, he would be fine. Another way to do it is you can gift shares of an owner, but that's a little more tricky. If you gift shares, you don't want to gift control. So he'd want to keep control, but he could have transferred ownership interest to children. You could do that and still keep control. So you'd never have to worry that because they own these interests, that somehow they're going to reach in and interfere with his leadership. So you can transfer ownership interest, non-voting shares, for example, in your company to your children. And yes, there is a gift tax, but the point is because they're not getting control, it's called a discount, a tax discount, which the IRS gives, because they recognize when there's a loss of control of an asset, then it diminishes its value dramatically. So let's say they own $1 million farm, and you decide to give $100,000 interest to each of your children. And let's assume, incidentally, this is a going concern as opposed to just raw land. It's a going concern. So they wouldn't pay. You wouldn't pay based on a $100,000 gift. You would actually pay on maybe 75, maybe 50, maybe 60. I mean, you get a big discount when you transfer property with a lot of limitations to it. And so that was another option that he had. He could have transferred interest during his lifetime. That could have been, I know that then the problem is you don't want them to be alienable. What that means is you don't want them to end up being part of a divorce. You don't want them to end up being transferred to somebody by the poor judgment of your children. So there are some checks you can put on that. But I could go on in terms of the examples. I mean, there were solutions.
Yeah.
And this was so avoidable. And none of us is going to live forever. So we're not asking too much of Joe. We're not demanding, that he be perfectly prescient to be able to see the future. We're not expecting that at all. Matter of fact, we're expecting of him to deal with the inevitable. Not to anticipate something very improbable, but to anticipate something certain. And maybe he didn't have to die the year he died, but it was going to happen. And I don't know what he thought, how he thought that would be paid out. Some people just assume they're going to live long enough to complete their plans.
But yeah, they don't. And it's crazy to me that he was even a lawyer and had all of that background. And I mean, probably knew a lot of that stuff and just never thought it completely through. It was kind of like the other stories we've seen. He just kind of threw something on paper, called it good for that day, and left it as is. Yeah.
He thought he could check that box. But, and he probably paid, in today's dollars, he probably paid that $2,500 I mentioned. It's, because you wouldn't pay more than that for the simple plan that he had. Maybe they charged him more because they knew he had more money. That does happen sometimes. But, if now when you think about what some of the things I just told you, you can see why a person, sticking with today's dollars, if they're told that they can spend $25,000 and have a plan like I just described that would do all this cool stuff and avoid taxes and all this stuff, it's such a bargain. It's such a bargain that people who pay that for their estate planning, believe me, they walk out happy. If they don't, they should be, because they've gotten probably the best investment they made. Among the best investments they've made in their career, I don't care how rich they are, is if they do the proper planning and pay $25,000 for it. So for you all, many of you watching, I know, are not in that category. So you're spending a lot less, and you will have in place a plan that will work beautifully for you. And it's a comparable statement. You should be delighted with it. I'm not suggesting that you go and hug your estate planning lawyer, but it wouldn't be a bad idea. But anyway, I hope this has been interesting to you. Thank you, Marlea, for that wonderful research and suggestion of this topic. So till next time, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.